As sea levels continue to rise, some of the world's most iconic places are at risk of disappearing forever, from sinking cities to vanishing islands. Here are 15 places that we're gonna lose to rising sea levels. Number 15. Venice. Venice, Italy has long captured the imagination of travelers, earning it the nickname Floating City for its picturesque canals and seemingly weightless charm. Yet, as enchanting as this image may be, Venice's reality is far more ominous. It's sinking, and this isn't new information. The city's been sinking for years, and the forces behind it are varied and complex. Venice was built on a network of small islands in a lagoon, supported by millions of wood piles driven deep into the mud. Over time, though, this foundation has proven vulnerable. By the mid-20th century, scientists began to fully understand the scope of its sinking problem. Artesian wells drilled for fresh water in the early 1900s exacerbated the issue as they drained the water underwater by 2100. Venice's charm is undeniable, but its sinking status also makes it a city on the edge of disaster. Frequent acqua alta events, or high tides, floods the streets and piazzas, sometimes making 75% of the city impassable. Number 14. New Orleans. New Orleans, like Venice, is a city battling a slow and relentless sinking. It's built on marshland at the mouth of the Mississippi River. The city's geography and topography make it especially vulnerable to subsidence. Since its founding in the early 18th century, New Orleans has faced the challenge of staying above water. Today, it's sinking at an alarming rate, and the future doesn't look promising. The French Quarter, the oldest part of the city, was built on slightly higher ground, about 10 feet above sea level. But as the city expanded, new areas were built on much lower, marshy land. This flat geography means that every foot matters when it comes to flood risk, and much of the city's land is now well below sea level. Today, areas. This architectural style is both a nod to the past and a necessary adaptation for a life in a sinking city. Number 13. Manhattan. Manhattan, it's the beating heart of New York City, and it's sinking, quite literally, under the weight of its own towering structures. It's not just rising sea levels that are threatening the city, but the sheer mass of over 1 million buildings. The city that never sleeps is slowly being pulled downward, and the relentless pace of construction only adds to that growing concern. Manhattan is sinking due to a combination of problems, with the most surprising being the physical weight of its buildings. A recent study published in the journal Earth's Future highlighted that New York City's 1,084,954 buildings weigh a staggering 1.68 trillion pounds. This enormous mass presses down on the Earth, causing it to sink at a rate of about 1 to 2 millimeters each year. Now that may seem small, but over decades it adds up. Some areas ground compression. It wasn't until recently that scientists specifically calculated the impact of New York City's buildings. The study that pinpointed this factor was published in 2023, marking a new understanding of how urbanization accelerates natural geological process. However, the sinking has been happening for decades, driven not only by the buildings, but also by human activities like groundwater pumping and construction on artificial fill. Number 12. The Maldives. The Maldives is a tropical paradise that's known for its crystal clear water, white sand beaches, and luxurious resorts, and it's facing an existential threat. This chain of islands in the Indian Ocean, with an average elevation of just 3 feet above sea level, is sinking at an alarming rate. As a low-lying country, the Maldives is one of the most vulnerable nations to climate change, and projections suggest that much of it could disappear within the next century. Several factors contribute to the sinking of the Maldives, but the most pressing is sea level rise. This phenomenon seems to be primarily driven by critical defense. Those coral reefs can absorb up to 97% of wave energy, but without them, the islands become more vulnerable to erosion and flooding. Number 11. China. China, one of the most populous and rapidly urbanizing countries in the world, is facing a critical environmental crisis. Its land is sinking. This phenomenon, known as land subsidence, is affecting a vast portion of the nation's urban areas, placing millions of lives and extensive infrastructure at risk. The country's largest cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, are sinking at rates that have prompted urgent scientific study and government intervention. But what's causing this alarming subsidence, and what can be done to prevent further damage? Well, the answers lie in a combination of human activities, urban weight, and climate-driven changes that together create a complex and dangerous situation. Many urban areas, particularly those in northern China, have relied on underground aquifers to meet the need for water. However, this accelerates it dramatically. In cities like Shanghai, which have experienced subsidence for decades, the weight of the city continues to push the land downwards, despite efforts to limit the damage. Quantifying the scale of this subsidence is both alarming and essential to understanding its full impact. Research has shown that nearly half of China's urban areas are sinking at a rate of at least 3 millimeters per year. In some of the worst affected areas, the rate's over 10 millimeters annually. This translates to around 270 million people living on land that is gradually sinking beneath them. Number 10. The Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands, a beautiful yet vulnerable archipelago in the Pacific Ocean, are on the front lines of a climate crisis. With a population of just over 500,000, these tropical islands have experienced the devastating impact of rising sea levels over recent decades. 5 of the Solomon Islands have already been lost to the encroaching ocean. That's a stark warning of what the future might hold for the island nation. The Solomon Islands are a sovereign country when it comes to the impact of this sea level rise. For now, the country has already lost 5 islands, and the damage is not just limited to physical geography. The loss of land is also a cultural and economic blow to the people there. Entire communities are being displaced, and traditional ways of life are disappearing as the sea encroaches further inland. Number 9. California. California's beaches are iconic, endless stretches of golden sand framed by rugged cliffs and the vast Pacific Ocean. The beaches here and the shores draw millions of visitors each year and are home to thriving beach communities. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic image lies a growing crisis. Beach erosion, driven by sea level rise, is threatening to reshape California's coastline in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. At its core, beach erosion refers to the gradual wearing away of land as it's swept into the sea. In California, this process is intensifying due to rising sea levels. First, the oceans. According to research, California could see sea level rise between 2 to 7 feet by the end of this century, with the worst-case scenarios predicting up to 10 feet. For every meter of sea level rise, the shoreline could retreat by more than 100 feet. In the most extreme cases, some studies estimate that as much as 75% of California's beaches could disappear by 2100. The erosion of those beaches carry a significant consequence, not only for the beautiful communities that line the coast, but for the state as a whole. Coastal properties, many of which are luxurious and highly valued, are directly in harm's way. And as the land erodes, home, businesses, and public spaces may face destruction or need to be abandoned altogether. Number 8. London. So London may not be a beach town, but it is in fact considered a coastal city, and it is also at risk of being submerged by rising tides of the Thames River. The alarming truth is that sea level rise, source of recent alarm, predicts that by 2050 much of London could be underwater if significant actions aren't taken. Particularly vulnerable areas, including those along the Thames, where water levels are expected to rise far beyond current flood protections. The rising sea levels threatening London are caused by 2 primary factors: the thermal expansion of the warming seawater and the melting of polar ice sheets. More water is introduced into the oceans, which is then seeping into river systems like the Thames, causing the water level to rise and increasing the risk of flooding. With each foot of rising water, London's defenses become more strained. A key point of concern is that while London has a robust flood defense, such as the famous Thames Barrier, these measures may not be enough to protect against future water levels without significant upgrades. Moving on to number 7, Lagos. Lagos is the largest city in Nigeria and one of Africa's most populous urban centers. It faces a grim future as rising sea levels, coastal erosion about the city's future. According to some projections, Lagos could experience catastrophic flooding by 2050, with areas less than 3 feet above sea level entirely submerged. As the planet warms, polar ice caps will melt and seawater expands, contributing to a global rise in ocean levels. Nigeria's Atlantic coastline, where Lagos sits, is no exception. Predictions suggest that sea levels could rise by 6 feet by the end of the century. The city's drainage system, or lack thereof, compounds this problem. Trash-clogged gutters and inadequate infrastructure worsen the flooding during Lagos's heavy rainy seasons. Rainwater's got nowhere to go, causing floodwaters to rise quickly in both wealthy and low-income areas. Coastal erosion further eats away at the city's protective barriers, while uncontrolled urban growth puts additional pressure on an already vulnerable landscape. Number 6. Honolulu. Honolulu, the capital of Hawaii, faces a slow but dire fate as sea levels continue to rise, threatening one of its already reached parts of the beach during high tides. And as sea levels rise, those occurrences will become more and more frequent and more devastating. Current projections show that more than 6,000 buildings and 20,000 people could be at risk, with vital assets like airports and ports becoming increasingly vulnerable. In the past few years, high tides have already caused seawater to flow onto Waikiki's bustling streets and footpaths. These sunny day floods happen even without storms. It's a clear indication of how vulnerable this area has become. The predictions are pretty sobering. More frequent and more severe flooding will reshape Waikiki and other parts of Oahu in the next few decades. The sad reality is, if sea levels continue to rise unchecked, there may be a future where Waikiki Beach, as it's known today, ceases to exist. Number 5. Norfolk. Norfolk, a historical coastal city in southeastern Virginia, is on the front lines of sea level rise. Situated along the Chesapeake Bay, it's home to the world's largest naval base, a vibrant port, and it may not seem like much. Over time, this accumulation has caused disastrous effects. The land in Norfolk and much of southeastern Virginia is sinking at rates of up to 6 millimeters per year. Combined with sea levels rising about 3 millimeters per year globally, this region is going to experience over 9 millimeters of effective land loss annually. This trend is driven largely by sea level changes, and warmer ocean temperatures will result in more moisture in the atmosphere, which leads to heavier and more frequent rainstorms. Additionally, the warmer air can hold more water vapor, causing storms to dump even more rain when they happen. Decades of extracting water faster than it can be replenished in the ground aquifers have left the region's lands soft and susceptible to sinking. Norfolk has become the East Coast's most vulnerable city to sea level rise, with the region expected to face more dramatic landscape changes in the coming decades. One of the city's most ambitious efforts to combat this flooding is a massive flood wall project designed in part with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This project of Alexandria. This city, founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, has withstood millennia of natural and human-made disasters. Yet today, the twin forces of rising sea levels and sinking land are threatening Alexandria's existence. The land on which Alexandria rests, along with much of the Nile Delta, is sinking at an alarming rate of more than 3 millimeters a year. This subsidence is exacerbated by human activity. Dams upstream on the Nile prevent the natural replenishment of silt that once fortified the delta's soil. On the other side, the Mediterranean Sea is rising. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that by 2100, global sea levels could rise by as much as 3 feet. The projections are grim. By 2050, even in the most optimistic scenarios, 1/3 of Alexandria could be underwater, with up to 1.5 million of its 6 million residents forced to leave their homes. Alexandria's slow sinking into the Mediterranean is not a sudden disaster. Since the 1960s, with iconic landmarks like the 19th century lighthouse at Rosetta vanishing into the sea. But beyond the monetary cost of trying to fix all this, the human toll is going to be profound. As Alexandria continues to sink, residents are caught between the pressures of staying in a city that may soon be uninhabitable and the uncertainty of leaving behind their homes, jobs, and community. The population is growing rapidly, adding further strain to the city's infrastructure. With nearly 2 million additional residents leaving in the last decade alone, the city's fragile systems are cracking under the weight of both environmental and human pressures. Number 3. Kiribati. Tucked away in the expanse of the Pacific Ocean lies Kiribati, a small island nation composed of 32 atolls and 1 raised coral island. Now, despite its expansive spread, Kiribati's total land area amounts to a mere 313 square miles, and its highest point barely rises 6.5 feet above sea level. Since the 1990s, sea levels in the area have risen by approximately 2 to 4 inches. Projections by NASA and other climate scientists say that this trend will only accelerate. The numbers here translate into real life-altering consequences for the people of Kiribati. Villages on the outer islands have already disappeared beneath the waves. Fresh water supplies have been contaminated by saltwater intrusion, and coastal erosion is eating away at what little land remains. Compounding all the natural vulnerabilities is the island's growing population. Since independence from Britain in 1979, Kiribati's population has boomed, particularly in the capital, South Tarawa, where nearly half of the nation's 110,000 people reside. South Tarawa is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, with settlements stretching in a near-continuous strip along a narrow causeway of land. Overpopulation has put immense pressure on the island's limited resources, resulting in environmental degradation, pollution, and a heavy reliance on imported goods. Is more people winning this battle, or is it on the verge of losing its long-standing war with water? Historically, people of Bangladesh have demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt to the natural rhythms of flooding. For centuries, rural communities farmed the fertile plains during dry seasons and retreated when the water levels rose. Flooding was not only accepted, but embraced as part of life. It replenished the soil and sustained agriculture, making the country's vast river delta one of the most fertile regions of the world. When the land became temporarily unusable, many sought work in the cities, relying on the annual flood cycle to shape their livelihoods. Yet today, floods and rising tides are far more sinister and unpredictable than those of the past. The Ganges Delta, which covers 2/3 of Bangladesh and is home to nearly 200 million people, stands at the forefront of this struggle. Storms that once occurred once a decade could soon strike 3 to 15 times per year by 2100, driven by changing sea levels and more violent weather patterns.